Hello, today we have the extreme pleasure of talking to the Dean of the School of Allied Health here at Loma Linda University, Dr. Craig Jackson. Dr. Jackson, thank you for taking the time today for this interview.
My pleasure, Heather.
You are currently the leader of the largest school here on campus. Tell me a little bit about your journey in leadership roles that has brought you to this point.
Well, when I was thinking about that question, my mind went back to actually the late 80s and early 90s when I was a clinical social worker at Loma Linda University Medical Center in the Department of Social Work. And I was the assistant director of social work and then became the director of social work. And when I think about that as a formal role, it was really a leadership role, and as well as a management role. But actually, activities in leadership go a little farther back than that for me. As you can see from where we're sitting, I have a musical background as well. And my father was a choral director, and so I grew up with music. And there was one time when I became the director of a group that I had been singing in. And I had never considered that a leadership position until many, many years later, when in fact, that was probably the beginning for me of leadership. So I think when I think about the answer to that question, I think about different times in my life when I was placed in a position where I had to actually provide some direction or leadership. And I guess I say that because I know that students are probably thinking that I'm not a leader until I actually get into a role where I have a title.
Right.
And if they look at their lives, they will realize that there have been times in their lives when they've taken leadership in a project, if they've taken leadership in something that's been volunteer, as well as when they move into professional life where they probably have a leadership role in something like that as well. So I can really identify both the formal leadership positions where I've had where there's been a title, but also looking back even before then, I've actually had an opportunity to test out leadership, if you will. And I can tell you it wasn't a pretty picture. And looking back on it, it's almost embarrassing to think about some of the things that I did that I thought was a part of leadership when in fact it was not. And a good example of that is the issue of delegation. I think that's something that really winds up being a problem for new people starting out in leadership, because as they've come up, they've made a name for themselves and they've built a reputation based on the work they do. And especially with healthcare professionals, we are measured by what we do in our interaction and our exchange with patients and the outcomes of that exchange. Then you move into a leadership position and you find yourself now having to get work done through other people. And that has been a really challenging transition for me especially. And I have seen it as I've talked to newer leaders as well. So there's also this transition period in one's thinking about moving into leadership, thinking that you have to do it all, versus this idea of delegation, which is probably a key point to leadership and what it means to be a leader.
Yeah. So how would you define leadership, or what does it mean to be a leader?
I think what it means to be a leader is to have a vision, first of all, and to be able to communicate that vision to other people. So it's not just a matter of knowing what to do, it's a matter of how you get others to buy into that vision. And so it has to be something that comes from the bigger picture. Right? So part of leadership is having a vision. The other part of it is being able to communicate that very well. So it's having it and then having communication skills that are also very, very important. And then being able to inspire other people to follow. That's probably the most challenging thing, because then there are some characteristics and traits that one needs when one has to lead. But I think once you get past the vision and the ability to articulate that vision, there also has to be a commitment to making things better. I think in one sentence, if I were to get one of those bumper sticker definitions, it would be leadership makes things better.
Fantastic. I love that definition. Very different from the idea that being a leader is a manager.
Right.
Very,
right.
very different.
And sometimes that gets confused. And I think what happens oftentimes too is that people value leadership above management. Both are very important and they're complementary, but they're different. You know, one of the things that I've seen in leadership literature that says that management does the right thing, leadership makes things right. And I think that's really very important, because leadership then has to be a broader perspective, where management is really about processes and systems in place that actually make the vision functional, because you have to have things in place in order to do that. But they are different, but they're also complementary. Most of the time, people find themselves in positions where they have to do a little bit of both.
Yeah. So what do you feel are traits of a leader?
Well, I think credibility is one. I think that when they talk about authenticity and honesty, and those tend to get to be catchphrases. But there's an idea of being able to build credibility, be able to build integrity so that people know what they see is really what they get. The other part of it, I think, is the integrity of being truthful. And it doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, but it means that we're truthful, and if we make a mistake, then we go back and we say, I blew that. Okay, that's, one of the things that we talk about here as you make decisions with our executive leadership here is that sometimes you make a decision, discover that new information or discover that it was based on faulty assumptions. So we go back and we make another decision. Right. So I think part of that truthfulness is not a matter of always being right, which I think is also another myth about leadership. But when you're not right, acknowledging that and then making another decision and continuing to move on. So I think it's the credibility, it's the truthfulness, it's that authenticity, and it's also that sense of having some sense of where you're going, but including other people in helping to develop that vision. So it's really a shared consensus. Doesn't mean we all vote on it, but within that broader vision, people get a chance to contribute. And then I think one of the last things I want to say about that, and we can talk about that a little bit more as we go along, is also the idea that leadership gets out of the way of the people that work with them and let them actually do what they do best.
Okay.
Because a lot of times you get insecure leaders who don't ever want to be upstaged by someone in their team that actually may have better skills in a particular area than they do. And an insecure leader then would really push them down so only they shine.
Yeah.
Which
More
is
micromanaging.
and more micromanaging, and that would be a good way of looking at it too. More micromanaging, rather than picking good people and then letting them do what you've asked them to do, and you'll be surprised how much you get, how much productivity you get because people are allowed to actually use their gifts.
So you're kind of talking a little bit about some emotional or some personality characteristics as well for a leader. And how would you describe some maybe emotional or personality characteristics that lead to good leadership?
Ooh, well, that's probably a really good one, probably a loaded one, because we all have such different personalities, and we have our different strengths as well in particular areas. I think when we talk about leadership temperament, we talk about the ability to pretty much be cool under pressure, because there are going to be stressful situations and challenges that come up. We're not always going to be right. We're going to stumble on occasion and make mistakes. And feedback that we get from people is not always going to be pleasant. So it's the ability to be able to recognize that we're not perfect, that we do have our strengths, but we also have our limitations, and I hate to call them weaknesses, but we have areas that we need to be aware of that need to be strengthened, if you will, and they can be weaknesses if we don't recognize that. So I think that the temperament is to recognize that idea of not being perfect, of everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and that oftentimes feedback we get is not going to be pleasant, but it's an important part of leadership. And I might want to add to that, by the way, when you talk about, well, we can talk about suggestions of leadership, but one that comes to mind that I want to mention right now is that a leader ought to always have someone who would give them the good, the bad, and the ugly. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, having someone who can speak truth to power.
Yeah.
That somebody who can come into your office and say, we need to talk. This is not going well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and be honest.
and be honest,
Right.
and know that you're not going to kill the messenger.
Yeah.
Because when we were talking about the insecure leader, if his or her team gets the impression or gets the feeling that the leader cannot take that kind of feedback, then they won't give it because they won't risk. And that's the kind of feedback that leaders want, that most of us, me included, we don't like to hear, but it is important and necessary to hear. So that's that part of recognizing you're not perfect.
Yes.
So that when you get that, it shouldn't throw you because you've already acknowledged that you're not perfect anyway.
Right.
And having someone, at least one, maybe a couple of people, who are not afraid to sit you down and to speak truth to power.
And being able to take that will allow you to be a stronger leader in the end.
Well, we certainly hope so.
Yes.
And in my experience, the answer has been yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. So what suggestions do you have for those who would like to improve upon their leadership skills?
All right, well, we talked about the one, know your own strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's good to take a leadership inventory. You know, we talk a lot about 360 evaluations, and those are really important. They're also quite stressful because you are going to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. But that's a good way of knowing what's happening in your environment. The other, I think, is to do a leadership inventory for yourselves. You have, for example, the Myers-Briggs, so you get a sense of what your personality is like, what your temperament is like, those strengths and weaknesses. What I like about the Myers-Briggs especially is it gives you your strengths, but it also shows you how your strength can actually be a weakness if you're not aware of it. For example, loyalty can be a strength. You're loyal to your team and to the people on your team. It can be a weakness if it's blind.
Yeah.
All right, so it's that kind of thing. The other issue, they have strength finders and a lot of other things out there that people can take on their own to give them an idea of their style, of their personality type. So I think that would be one suggestion. The other would be find a mentor. As a matter of fact, find more than one mentor. The leadership program that I went through suggested that you identify a diversity of leadership mentors, male, female, in your discipline, in your area, outside your area, a number of different people whose opinion you respect and whom you believe know you very well. So having a mentor, I think, is very, very important. And I think the other would be how we stay attuned to leadership. And it's the idea of reading a lot of things that are outside your area. That seems to come up a lot. Read about aerospace, or as we were talking about earlier, when I was growing up at 12 or 13, I was bred on World War II war movies, so I thought I was going to be a fighter pilot. So maybe I read something about airplanes, read something about airlines, even though we're in healthcare. Read something about how Google developed even. You know? So reading and staying up on things like that. Probably the most important thing that we can do to improve our leadership, and it is really probably the hardest thing to do, and I have to remind myself regularly, is self-care. There's a book called The Power of Full Engagement that I've read twice now, and I'm on the third time again. And it talks about the idea of taking care of ourselves both physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. That what we bring to leadership is us. And if we're not taking care of that, and if we allow ourselves to get tired or fatigued, we become susceptible to any number of things. We can become irritable, we can become self-doubting, a lot of different things. So taking care of oneself is very important. Getting exercise, getting sleep, finding something that renews us so that we can come back again. So taking time off is important. And I think a lot of times leaders feel that we have to go and go and go and go and go. And we probably reduce our own effectiveness and our own productivity when we're not rested and when we're not sharp enough. I was telling the students the other day at orientation about Johannes Gensfleisch. Nobody knows that last name. We know him as Gutenberg. His father's name was Gensfleisch, means goose flesh in German. You can imagine what he went through in elementary school. I can imagine why he took on Gutenberg instead. But the whole idea of the printing press came when he and his family were on vacation in Bavaria, and they went to a winery. And he was looking at the wine press. And through that whole thing, eureka, I have found it, the idea of the printing press, and hence the idea of printing press taken from the wine press. He didn't get that doing what he was doing every day. He came up with a solution, or he came up with an inspiration while he was doing something else. And that's very important, and that's a part of that self-care that's so very, very important. And so in addition to all those other kinds of things that I just mentioned, I think self-care is probably the important key.
Worth great advice for our students as well.
Exactly. Because I know that they're going to be challenged. The curriculum is tight, it's very demanding, and as it should be. I mean, that's really a part of quality education. But even within that, I tell students all the time, if you're not taking off an hour at least 3 days a week to hit the gym or to do something that's fun and that's playful, they're really not maximizing their productivity or maximizing their education. So you're right. They start right now by taking care of themselves and recognizing that doing that is a part of them developing their leadership. So it's not separate from that, that they're actually starting now in that direction. There's something else I'd like to say about that as well, about leadership as well. And it came from, it was last year, I think it was October 6th, when the president was giving the Medal of Honor posthumously to a staff sergeant who was fighting in Afghanistan. And to make a long story short, the group came under ambush. He gave the order to retreat to his team, along with about a dozen Afghan soldiers. While they were retreating, he moved toward the enemy to draw their fire while his group retreated. He took their fire, he killed a number of the enemy, and he was mortally wounded at the same time. And while he was wounded, he was also calling in close air support against the enemy as well. And what hit me as I was listening to that was, in addition to leadership making things better, leadership is selfless, and leadership looks out for your people, and leadership makes things better. So the idea that a leader is all about themselves is not really a strong leader. The things that we do as leaders ought to be focused on others, not on ourselves. So we're always looking out for what's best for the school, what's best for faculty and students, what's going forward. So there are many times that things that we do are really not about us, but they're about those for whom we have responsibility in leadership. I remember before I started in leadership positions, and I would see people, even friends of mine who were in industry, who did a lot of traveling. And I said, wow, this is really cool to be going out doing that much traveling. Well, it's really not all that cool. You know, it is quite tiring, but it is an important component sometimes of leadership. And so there are times when we need to go places as leaders that we probably don't want to go, but that are important if you take the larger picture and you're looking out for your team, that sometimes we need to go and to do things that we probably wouldn't want to do ourselves, or to not do things that we would want to do, because that would be more focused on ourselves rather than on what's good for the team. So when I saw that ceremony, that's what really hit me, was the idea that the sergeant was selfless and that he put himself in harm's way because he was concerned about his team. And also leadership too is about how one uses influence for the benefit of others. Again, the idea of really selfless and looking out for your team, because we as leaders have influence. We can use it for self-aggrandizement and to build up ourselves, or we can use it for the benefit of others to get things done. And so as a leader, you share the compliments, but you're really the one that takes the responsibility and takes the blame should anything happen, but you share the responsibility. And Harry Truman said it well, the buck stops here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful advice. Any last words of wisdom for our future leaders?
Well, just hang in there. Hang in there. You have some good days and some bad days. I remembered hearing something the other day that I thought was interesting. Sometimes in days of leadership, sometimes you're the pigeon and sometimes you're the statue. And that's just the way it goes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for your time.
It's my pleasure, Heather. Anytime.
Thank you.
Anytime.